The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. This is the first webinar of 2019, so lovely to have you all with us. And in fact, this is a re-recording of Peak Aggro or Peak Stupidity, the webinar I recorded a few hours ago. We had some problems with the sound on that session. Citrix have fixed that, and hopefully now the sound is okay. So without further ado, let's run through this. I apologize for the fact we had sound issues, but let's get back to the more exciting topic of markets. And of course, markets are rational, orderly, and sometimes predictable. Those of you who are trading futures, I congratulate you, because by definition, in my book at least, that makes you rational people. Let's get along onto the serious stuff here. And I want to talk about today this enormous growth in aggro that we seem to have had. I know that those of you in the United States will be a little more used to it. You seem to have a much more robust political system, and certainly much more robust and much higher levels of competition in your media, and you get the story and all sorts of other stories as well. But I've been struck by the fact that the level of aggravation seems to be on the up. It seems to be, to me, that everywhere you turn there's disputes, anger, unhappiness, and I wanted to just explore that with you and see what that's led to, because in some issues lately we've actually got a keyhole, we've got some insights into areas we don't usually get insights. So let's start with the proposition that the antidote to war is mercantilism, or as one of you said, war is the result of failed mercantilism. But World War II, basically, this is a gross oversimplification, but Germany wanted resources and land, Hitler's living space, as he called it. Japan wanted oil and steel, and when they were faced with sanctions from the United States, particularly on their oil supplies coming from what was then the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, they attacked at Pearl Harbor, as all of you know. The history of Europe has in many ways been a history of Germany in more recent times, modern times at least. Both the World War I and World War II saw Germany as a belligerent, and one of the reasons for the EU, which started off as a European Steel Community agreement, expanded to become this huge concept of a multinationality entity having free access between themselves for trade, movement of people, etc. And one of the main thinking points behind that was to lock Germany in as a non-belligerent family partner of its other European nations, or as those of you who are old enough to have seen and remember, yes, Minister, so France could get others to pay for its totally inefficient farming sector. But that was part of the mechanism of the rehabilitation, if you like, of Germany. And post-war Japan was General MacArthur's greatest triumph. Japan became effectively a United States protectorate for many years after the war, and his success really equates to the Marshall Plan for Europe. He oversaw the rebuilding of Japan and launching it on its modern status where it is today. One of the questions is what happens when mercantilism opposes mercantilism. Many of the issues we've seen that have led to war have been battles over resources, battles over access to resources. These days, with a global market, we'd say, well, you can have as many resources as you can pay for, and in many cases, if you can't pay for it, the World Bank or others will fund you to pay for it. And what we're going to see now is a battle between China and the USA and others, effectively over mercantilism as its major base plate, but also over other issues of land and control of resources. China, I think, is well, you know, it's the growing economy, the growing power. Historically, China was a great power. They certainly have more than pretensions of returning to that. Hong Kong's already been gobbled up. Taiwan is on the agenda to be restored, and the Chinese, mainland Chinese, view Taiwan as a rogue province, and have recently said they'll take whatever steps are necessary to retain the right to incorporate Taiwan into mainland China's field of hegemony in the future. But what we're seeing now with China is not only the arguments between two mercantile countries. China, a great mercantile power already, and probably heading to be the dominant economic power in the next couple of decades, and the USA. But we're also seeing this push about what's called the 9-dash line. And the 9-dash line is a very old map that with 9 dashes delineated what China claims was its historical ownership of and control of the Yellow Sea. There have been all sorts of little islands built there where there were reefs, where there were small land masses. They've been expanded by China. And this has gone on quite openly. It happened mainly while Obama was president. He didn't seem to be concerned about it. He certainly allowed it to happen. And it's now got the stage that these islands, the Spratlys and the Parcels, are established. China's dredged around them, built them up into reasonable little islands, big enough to take jet fighters, and has also militarized some of them. It now claims, of course, ownership not only of the 12-mile waters around it, but control of all of the resources in that area. And that area goes very, very close to Vietnam, very close to Borneo, very close to Indonesia, very close to the Philippines, and encroaches on what they would regard as their exclusive economic zones. This argument's already been to one of the world courts, who found that China did not have merit for their claims, and the USA and its allies are now trying to deny those claims by having their vessels sail through what the Chinese would claim are territorial waters. And that conflict's been going on now for a couple of years, and I think it is a flashpoint worth keeping your eye on that could be a trigger to something a lot more serious than the argy-bargy we're seeing over it at the moment. Let's wait till this changes for you. The screen, yes, you can see it now. Look at the issues we're facing every day. Trump and the Dems, Trump and some of his own party earlier on in his term of government, and much of that is centering around the argument of the wall, which part of Trump's policy, in fact probably the main part of his policy, that he laid out and spruiked while he was campaigning for the position as president, and the alternate, which is open borders. And of course, sotto voce, many of the leading Democrats are actually on record as supporting border security, but now it's them versus Trump. They can't agree on anything at all. And you sort of start to wonder whether this is peak aggro or peak stupidity. Last week, the leader of the Dems led to Trump saying, well, we don't want you to have your State of the Nation report while the government's in shutdown, put it off to another day. Trump responded yesterday by cancelling Mrs. Pelosi's trip to Europe and Egypt, which was a PR sort of demonstration. On the same basis, I don't think it's appropriate for you to take a trip while the federal employees are not getting paid. So there's sort of tit for tat going on and on and on. In France, the yellow shirts, as they're called, these are the populace, they wear the yellow shirts that many tradesmen wear. That's why their pressers call them the yellow shirts. They're in open revolt against Macron and his policies. And it started with an increase in petrol taxes, and it's now morphed into all sorts of other complaints. So it's been violent. They've been taking over the main streets of Paris. They've been defacing the Arc de Triomphe with graffiti and other monuments. There's open running battles between the protesters and the police every weekend. The whiff of revolution, which France, of course, is famous for, is in the air. And across the channel, we've been seeing the British arguing with themselves over Brexit. Those of you who follow international affairs will know that 2 years ago, Britain was given the opportunity of a referendum where the people voted, the population, those of them who wanted to vote. Voting not compulsory in England, as in Australia, of course, it is compulsory. They voted to leave, to exit from the European Union, hence the word Brexit, British exit. And for the last 2 years, there have been endless arguments between the British over, over what that means. And the prize at the end of it, of course, is access to the European single market, the European market, on which Britain's very, very reliant. The British are trying to have their cake and eat it. They're trying to negotiate a position where they are not a member of the European Union. They're not paying their dues. They're not abiding by European court decisions, European dictates from the massive bureaucracy that runs the European Union, but that they can have all or a substantial access to the European single market. And that's gone over like a lead balloon. Mrs. May, Theresa May, the new Prime Minister of Great Britain since David Cameron resigned after losing the Brexit vote, her performance could only be described as woeful. In 2 years of negotiation, the very best she's been able to come up with is a bill which would allow Britain to retain its rights for another 2 years as a European member and to negotiate for another 2 years. I mean, absolutely woeful, absolutely woeful. So now that argument, Britain against Britain, and also against the European leaders who are doing their absolute utmost, very successfully, to make life as difficult for the British as they can, to make a demonstration of the penalties to be paid for anyone else who's thinking of leaving the European Union. Strangely enough, just this week, the British Parliament voted on the bill that Mrs. May has proposed to ensure the exit of Britain from the European Union, and it was hugely, overwhelmingly defeated in the House of Commons, with a vast percentage of the ruling party voting against its own leaders. So you would think that that would be a signal for a rise in chaos. In fact, markets loved it. The British pound's been steadily and dramatically appreciating since that vote. So the markets are obviously saying they don't want the uncertainty. Markets hate uncertainty. They don't want the uncertainty of a negotiated Brexit. They'd far rather the whole idea was dropped and that there was no Brexit, or indeed there's a possibility, talk at least, of another referendum, presumably on the view that that would reverse the previous vote. I just don't see how that's possible at all. So you know about the China-USA thing. It probably doesn't appear on your screens much because American press is besotted with the Trump versus the rest arguments, but I suggest you keep an eye on the USA-China issues, particularly what's happening around Taiwan and what's happening in the South China Sea. In my part of the world, we've got Australians yelling at Australians. We have elections, federal elections coming up in May this year, and the government, the coalition ruling party, which is made up of the Liberals, who are not Liberals, as you would understand it. They're the Conservative Party, called the Liberal Party, and their coalition partners, the Nationals, who are a country-based party. They're the party of the man on the land, or the farmers and graziers, if you like. They have been so woeful that even the staunchest, most right-wing supporter is sort of getting to the stage of saying they can't continue to govern. They've just been totally and utterly hopeless. And I think the betting odds are vastly in favour of a change of government in May, which will bring in the Labour Party, who are, excuse me, have a little bit of a socialist bent. They call themselves the Party of the Workers, and their motto is a free go for all Australians. Or a fair go, I should say. I've misquoted them. It's a fair go for all Australians. Well, inherent in the argument about what's a fair go is a redistribution of wealth. And there are going to be some pretty dramatic changes to the taxation system. We have a interesting system in Australia, which will be quite foreign to Americans, because in your country you're allowed to deduct interest on mortgages on your home, your principal place of residence, up to a very substantial amount. In Australia and New Zealand, we don't have that at all. There are no deductions for interest on mortgages, repayments on your principal place of residence. But what has been allowed is that if you buy an investment property, that is something that is not your principal place of residence, the income from that will be taxable, but you can negatively gear it. In other words, you can borrow enough money so that the interest payments on the loan are greater than the income that's produced by that property. In other words, that's negatively geared. It loses money, but you can offset your other forms of income, including your wages and salaries, against those losses. So, in effect, those losses are subsidised by the taxpayer. It goes a bit further than that as to how, when you do finally sell it, how the capital gain is treated. They're very concessional rates on capital gain for investment properties. Now, the ability to work investment properties as tax minimisation schemes has led very much part of the massive historic all-time boom we've seen in Australian prices. That peaked, they're saying, in September 2017, but to a casual observer, it certainly looked like it was on full roar through most of 2018. And the prices that have been reached in the major capital cities, Sydney and Melbourne in particular, are staggering. If I told you that the price of an average house, think about what average means, I can tell you it's not very nice, it's pretty ordinary. The price of an average house in Sydney is almost $1 million. It's quite extraordinary. I have, for many years, in fact, I've talked to you about it on webinars, saying I simply can't understand how these people manage to borrow the money, what sort of a story they're telling their bankers. And of course, a great part of that has been the rise of the two-income family. It seems to be pretty universal that women are now back in the workforce big time, and the idea that one man's salary could support and provide a home and support for a family, that's gone. You pretty well need two incomes to afford the mortgage on a house these days. And the price, the Australian housing, price of residential housing has just been absolutely extraordinary, way out there. But of course, government has been happy for that to go on, because most politicians own a house, or many of them own negatively geared houses, and they're making a fortune. And as long as prices are up, at least the household sector is happy. And now, of course, that prices are starting to go down, Australia and Sweden and one other country are ranked by Fitch as the worst, most overpriced properties in the world. We're going to see some pretty dramatic stuff in the Australian property market. Already, people who bought off the plan for units, basic rule there is developers get approval to build. They go to their bank to finance the build. The bank says, well, when you've got 60% or whatever the number is they put onto these units pre-sold, we'll put up the finance to build it. Australia's been running at the same time absolute record levels of immigration, and the hidden immigration has been the growth of fee-paying universities. Australia's had this cosy little deal that if you are a foreign student and you come and study at one of our universities for a few years, the thinking is that you'll be assimilated into Australian values and ways, and we'll give you a provisional right to fast track into residency and then into Australian citizenship. And that's been going like a house on fire. The number of foreign students, largely Asians, particularly prominently Chinese and Indians, has been quite staggering. And of course, thankfully, both those groups make very, very good citizens. They're industrious, hard-working people, very, very motivated on business, getting ahead, providing for their families. They make very good citizens, unlike some of the others that we have experienced over the years. So we have a new election coming in May. You can count on a new government, in my view, and then you can observe what happens when the socialists get hold of the steering wheel. And you can see what the rhetoric of the new slightly left of left Democrats in the American House of Representatives are arguing about, and how that's going to flow into policy for the Democrats. It seems that political parties all over the world are being pushed to extremes. They're either going left or in the anti-immigration countries, the countries that have been hit with unwanted and uncontrolled immigration, particularly in Europe, they've been pushed to the right. And we're seeing all sorts of people leading political parties who in more normal times would be undesirable. You're probably sick of me talking about Brexit, but in the idea of peak stupidity, I do make the point that Brexit was run as a very, very emotional campaign, pitting Englishmen against Englishmen, and the Leave campaign was led by a politician called Boris Johnson. He's a very affable guy, very charismatic man. He was mayor of London. He was fronting the Leave campaign. And when the Leave campaign unexpectedly, this was a bit like Trump winning his election, all of the polls, all of the pundits said it wasn't going to happen, and it did. The Leave campaign got up. That led to the resignation of the then Prime Minister David Cameron, who called the referendum, and one would have thought that one of the proponents of the Leave campaign would have been chosen as leader, but no way. They wouldn't have it, and the Conservative Party voted for Mrs. May, who was a dear old thing. She was a minister in the Cameron government, totally hopeless, immigration minister, responsible for all sorts of outrages, and totally ineffective. And she's proved to be pretty much the same as Prime Minister. But she herself is a Europhile. She supported the Remain group, was not involved at all in the Leave campaign, and that's now what you're seeing, a pretty half-hearted effort to get Britain out of Europe and to fulfil the will of the people. But of course, the will of the people, you would think, we're taught this in Politics 101, the politicians serve at the will of the people, and their job is to implement the will of the people. And what you're seeing in Britain and America is that those mandates don't seem to be being honoured. Clearly, the Britain's vote, public referendum, universal referendum, British to vote, they voted to leave the European Union. That's really not being honoured by the politicians, with vast percentages of the ruling party opposing it. In the US, Trump certainly has a mandate to build the wall. It was the thing he campaigned on. It was number one promise, and normally mandates in politics are respected, but not so in the US, and at the moment not so in the UK either. So these keyholes I'm talking about, institutions are purposely opaque, and occasionally unintended keyholes allow us to peer behind the veil. So Cameron's referendum on Brexit was a keyhole. That's allowed us to have a whole lot of insights into the British parliamentary system, which normally are hidden. The politics is stage managed. It's all spin and buddies with select reporters, and it's a very, very controlled device. The keyhole that Brexit opened has allowed us to see the total utter shambles and the total incompetence, not only of government but of the advisors. And of course, Britain invented the professional bureaucrat, and one would have thought they'd have had the skills to do this job, but clearly they haven't. In 2018, Australia had a Royal Commission into banking and financial services, and that's been a huge keyhole. The government of the day opposed that. There have been calls for inquiries into the banking sector for years and years, absolute outrage over some banking policies, the more obvious ones, and eventually and very reluctantly, because the banks are the primary clients of the coalition government, the government was forced, after a few more scandals, I should say, to commission a Royal Commission into the banking services and financial services. Now, Royal Commissions are devices whereby an eminent person, usually a retired High Court judge or someone of that sort of standing, is appointed as a commissioner, and they have public hearings, and they have power to subpoena people to give evidence. They have power to subpoena documents. They have power to compel testimony. And the idea is that they will really cut to the truth of the issue. Well, what happened with this Banking Royal Commission, as it's called, it was the proper name is the Financial Services Royal Commission. What happened is that the government very grudgingly had to agree to this because of the scandals that were happening with the banking system. But they tried to whitewash it. They gave it a very, very short time frame to have its hearings and report. It was very, very under-resourced, and what it was able to do really was just give us these little snapshots into the various sectors of financial services, the banks mainly, the financial services, the trustees, the companies that manage savings, the population savings, and that's a huge deal in Australia because we have what's called compulsory superannuation, which was brought in by Paul Keating, a Labor Prime Minister, about 40 years ago. Don't hold me to that, I'm not quoting from my history notes. But under the compulsory superannuation, all salary and wage earners have 9% deducted from their pay packet every pay period, and that has to be lodged in approved superannuation funds. And the managers and trustees of those funds are variously some trade union officials, lots of ex-government buddies and ministers, and professional fund managers. It's cut pretty much into two groups. There's what's called the industry funds. They're largely the ones where the big trade unions dominate. And strangely enough, they didn't get much of a run at all before the Royal Commission. They've done very well, and relative at least to the other side, which are the funds that have been set up by the banks, particularly the four major banks in Australia, which have protected species. One of the problems, the total problems with our banking system is that the four major banks are a protected species, so they're not subject to takeover. There are limits on what share of their equity in their stock foreign banks can own, and major banks have been totally unable to get a foothold in Australia. Even big banks like Citibank, they're really peripheral players. The four major, the four pillars as they're called, are so strong. And they've really been the naughty boys, and they've set up these superannuation funds, and it's been a gravy train. They've been ripping off the punters left, right and centre. Compulsory, the first thing they do is whack everyone into, give them a life insurance policy. Well, the question that's never asked is, did you get quotes on the open market? Was this really competitive? Well, turns out not. Most of them seem to have had an in-house broker or an in-house insurer tied to the same bank who's put their hand out and gobbled that up. The fees that have been taken are staggering, and the performance pretty much has been abysmal. This Royal Commission's allowed us a real keyhole into that. And I'll tell you more about that as we go. But in the same way, declining equity markets are a keyhole, because when markets are going up and up and up all the time, as equity markets do most of the time because they're engineered to do that, everyone's pretty happy and there are no embarrassing questions. But when the market has a downturn, even an insignificant downturn, as we saw on the December quarter, in the big scheme of things, that's not a big deal, that pullback at all. But it just totally knocks the props out from underneath all of the managed funds in Australia, and their results are appalling. The obvious answer is they don't hedge, and that's for a variety of reasons. Many will claim they don't have a mandate to do that, in which case one would have said, well, thought sensible thing would be to get that mandate changed. But it's staggering to me to think that the first obligation of anyone handling money would be a bit like the Hippocratic oath that doctors take, first do no harm. But it appears that's not the case. It appears, in fact, on any impartial reading of the evidence, is that the vast majority of these players are slaves to the market. The market goes up, they'll go up, they'll boast about it, they'll boost it. You'll get all of the promotion about it. When the market goes down, they're powerless. They're just literally tied to the market. It's pathetic. This next slide, I think it's changed for you now. There's more about Brexit. You've probably heard enough about it, except to just remember that uncontrolled immigration was a major issue. Under the EU, European Union rules, the free movement of people between member countries is guaranteed, and Britain was getting a huge influx of migrants from other cultures, and particularly with the story, the anecdote is about the Polish plumbers. Apparently massive numbers of plumbers from Poland were coming to England. They were prepared to work for much less than established English plumbers. So all of this is code for I don't like competition. Under this issue, at least, national autonomy is traded for market access. And what the Brits are trying to do is regain their autonomy, but keep their market access. And that's proved to be a losing strategy so far, big time. Australian hedge funds done very poorly, had their worst annual returns in nearly a decade. According to Mercer, they're very reputable people who monitor the Australian performance of Australian shares and the various funds that trade them. You look at the last paragraph here, this is the December quarter. Of course, the market bottomed just on the 26th of December. So they had to take all of that into account in their quarterly report. Active Australian share funds, the median of them lost 9.6% before fees. Let me tell you, fees are considerable, and the benchmark itself had only fallen 8.1%. So not only were they not hedged against the fall in the market, but their performance was worse than the benchmark. And that is, as they hasten to say, before fees. Add in the fees, and it was a bloodbath. And you're going to see the same thing in the States when these reports start circulating, the same in Britain. Universally, I think I talked to you about what's happened and what we've seen through the Royal Commission into financial services, because all of the failures that we see are in fact human nature. Their greed of one form or another. And that's universal. Human emotions are pretty well universal. So the way this superannuation works, after your money is deducted from your pay packet, it's matched by your employer. It goes off to one of these entities. You can either pick yourself, or if you don't make a pick, your money will be loaded into what's called the default provider. And the default provider is one chosen by the people who set up the fund. In the case of the industry funds, largely the trade union people controlling it. In the case of the banks and other funds, largely the big banks that sponsor these funds and effectively provide the trustees and managers. And what we've seen time after time after time is the trustees are not trustworthy. As the name implies, a trustee has an absolute obligation, fiduciary and otherwise, to act in the best interest of the members of that trust. And the evidence is, in many cases, with the institutions that were examined, primarily those linked to the major banks, they did not act in that manner. They acted in a manner that preferred the profit motive of the bank and the extraction of fees over all else. Now, that's a pretty damning indictment, but get hold of some documents on the Australian Banking Commission. You will be amazed. I've been an attorney, as many of you know, for many, many years, and to me it was staggering. It's just blatant theft. And the argument's now arisen that seeing government has the yay or nay effectively through their regulators over whether licenses are granted to operate a bank or a deposit-taking institution, etc., the argument now arises that there is a social license involved, and the argument put forward that because banks and financial institutions have these privileges endowed by permission from the government's regulators, they have a social license to act in the best interest of the population at large. And it took a very hard-headed economist, Ken Henry, who has been Treasurer of Australia, or rather has been run the Department of Treasury as a senior public servant before he retired to get on the gravy train. But it took him past head of the Treasury Department to say that's bunkum. The obligation of companies is to make money for their shareholders and nothing else. And of course that went over like a lead balloon because in this day and age of social media, we seem to have all sorts of implied obligations to act properly, to act as decent human beings, and to act in the interest of our clients, etc. As it turned out, everything about the institutions that were linked to banks that were examined came out that it's all about sales and incentives. Incentives are so powerful that social license, so-called social license, seriously can't compete with the profit motive. And of course, the big burning question was never asked. And the question to me is, how competent are you people at making money for your clients? And that seems to be the one thing that's never asked. There's now a discussion about, would it be a good idea to require these institutions handling the public's money to have a measurable form of performance. In other words, what they call a beauty parade. Some suggested that it would be wise to list the 10 best performing funds, the idea being that that would shame or embarrass the other funds, and that people would be much more aware, if that was given prominent publicity, of what was happening to their money. Whereas at the moment, the evidence is that the average punter, the average worker, just doesn't know what's happened to his superannuation, and what's more, doesn't care. To them, it's just a compulsory deduction. They think they're going to get some money back when they're 60 if they work hard all their lives, and this money's well invested, but they're not switched on, they're not financially literate, and they don't really know what's happening, and they don't care. What flows from that is the the question is never asked. Even this idea of a beauty parade, let's list the 10 best performers, in the hope that companies that don't have that performance will be forced to lift their game. And there have been howls of protest. There's all sorts of arguments, including one that says, we are by definition a low return fund because we're much more focused on safety. So we're not ever going to match those results. And of course, what we've seen from the latest Mercer survey is they're not focused on safety at all. They're focused on a free ride and gouging the system as much as they can. I thought it was a real eye-opener that one of the poor hapless folks who was pulled before this Royal Commission was a guy who's the chief executive of a fund that had done outstandingly well. It was the top-ranked performing fund over the last year, 3 years, and 5 years. And he was hauled into the Royal Commission and asked why he spent so much money on entertaining and hospitality. And the particular focus was a large amount of, well, relatively large amount of money that he'd spent buying premier seats for the Australian Open tennis in Melbourne. And he said, it's hospitality and entertaining. And the Royal Commissioner, who was a retired High Court judge who, like some of that ilk, had been fairly protected from what goes on in the real world, said, it isn't the fact that you're the leading fund, you've done so well, it's all documented. Doesn't that attract clients to you? And he, the chief executive guy, said, no, it doesn't. He said, that's why we're spending so much money entertaining the heads of businesses, because they're the guys who decide which is going to be their default provider of superannuation management. And he said they all have their own relationships with their own banks, i.e., they're getting better terms on their own mortgages or home loans or whatever other deals they're doing. And the Royal Commissioner was outraged. He was astonished. He said, you mean to tell me that your standout performance does not attract business to you? And he said, that's right. And I thought, wow, that really tells the story, doesn't it? But the question is never asked. These guys are pretty much free to dance and deal with whoever they want, regardless of the interest of the client. So it's been pretty damaging. The report's going to come out in about 2 weeks. I do suggest you get a copy of it. So when is a mandate and when is it not? Well, we've got this issue with the wall, haven't we, which clearly was a mandate in political terms. Trump put that squarely in front of the electorate. Said, I want to build a wall. These are the reasons why. It had a few issues tacked on about Mexico's going to pay for it. I guess that probably made a difference. That hasn't happened. But it's a mandate. One of the reasons that hedge funds don't hedge is they say, well, we don't have a mandate to hedge. We're a long-only fund. We can either be long or flat and invested in cash. I would have thought that the literacy of our regulators cannot be so poor that some bright young chap's not going to say, well, how about getting the mandate changed? Particularly going forward, let me tell you, we're seeing volatility in markets at the moment, in equity markets, and volatility begets volatility. I expect 2019 to be a very, very volatile year. So, that raises that whole question of trading versus investing. And I know that most of you have investments in the share market. You have 401ks and other savings accounts. And, I'm often asked, what do I do about my investments? Well, don't ask me. That's not my business. My business is futures trading. And fortunately, with futures, we get paid exactly the same if the market's going up as we do as if the market's going down. And that's why futures is just such a great hedging tool. There are many other derivatives that do the same thing, but immediacy is paramount. But I hope that the point you've got from my discourse, and thank you for bearing with me on this, is that the level of management expertise and not only expertise but candour, preference of beneficiaries' interests. The lack of that in the Australian financial system has been simply appalling. And you can bet whatever's happening in Australia is happening in your part of the world at all. But we've had a keyhole to see a little bit of that. So now let's move on to what's the antidote to all of that, which really is trading. And let's have a little look at some interesting issues, in particular of trading time, and seeing as this has been so important to focus on equities in this discussion. I'm going to continue with that. This is the S&P Mini contract. This is the 057, or the continuous contract from Trade Navigator. And this is the pullback that we had in January, and we're taking a snapshot of it looking only at time. And those of you who've been with us for a while will know that we have four main time zones on the macro level. This does not apply when we get down to trading. We have other cycles within these cycles, but the four dominant cycles in time trading are 44, 59, 62, and 70. 44 is the cycle that comes specifically from gold. Those of you who are interested in time cycles, go to the Daniel Code website, www.thedanielcode.com, and take a look at two articles in particular. They're called Masterclass 1, it's about time, and Masterclass 2, Trading Gold. And you'll see there how the 44 Daniel Code cycle for 44 came into being. These numbers here, 44, 59, 62, they are primary ratios that come out of the Daniel Code itself. 70 is another ratio that comes. It comes from a different part of the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. We call it the heathen ratio. There's nothing heathen about it. I just use that expression to indicate it's not part of the family of Daniel Code ratios, which all come out of chapter 12 of the book of Daniel. But 70 in another part of the book of Daniel was so interesting that Sir Isaac Newton used it in his treatise Observations on the Prophecies of St. John. For those of you that don't know, Sir Isaac Newton, the father of modern science, was a devout Christian, and actually wrote more about his Christian beliefs than he did about maths and physics. And in that document, which is available, it's free on the internet, it's called Observations on the Prophecies of St. John, he takes the number 70 and he uses that, and he says that the book of Daniel is the most important book in the Bible because it foretells the coming of the Messiah. And he uses an Old Testament book, which should have no concept of the Messiah, at least in times of the date of his birth and his arrival in Jerusalem, and he uses the 70 period to demonstrate all those things on a mathematical basis. For those of you who are interested in this sort of thing, get it. It's a great read, of course, by one of the most brilliant minds that the world's ever seen. But have a look at this. Here we are, and we've started. You look at the blue line on the left of the chart, go to the extreme left, you'll see a blue line, a mid-blue line. That's the start. That's where we're running the timing from. And on this case, it's on a low before the low. That low is actually 1 point higher than the next low that came 5 days later, 4 days later, apparently. And we call that a low before the low. And for all of these timing cycles, we start from either a low before the low or a high before the high. And we just put on these fixed cycles. They don't move, they're fixed. They start from any swing high or any swing low, particularly this with a high before the high and a low before the low. And here you are. We had 70 right sitting happily along on that bar, which was January 29th, 2018. Now, we started that count on October the 19th, 2017. So there you are, 14, 15 months later. It gives you it gave us the high there perfectly. Now, this is not about trading. I'll come to trading a little bit later on here in a cursory way. But this is about the time cycles, and you're going to see something quite extraordinary here. So we move on. I'll wait for it to change for you. This is called Finding the Low, and we've now moved on. Our starting blue line has moved up, and it's now on the closing high of that move. That's November the 8th. Well, the next day gave us the high, the chart high, but this November the 8th gave us the closing high of that swing. And starting from there, you can see that the 62 line, the blue line, often gives us lows. It nailed the crash low, the mini crash low, I should say, on February the 6th. At the same time as that moved along, the 70 also moved along, as it has to, and it was sitting on February the 16th, which turned out to be a small counter trend high. The next chart, now watch this carefully. Here's the next chart. We've moved the blue along now. It's starting from a swing high. It started from a swing high on January the 9th. Look what's happened now. The counter trend high on March the 12th is now being hit by the 44 cycle. The next low is on the 59 cycle, 1 day early. Now remember, these time cycles are valid to plus or minus 1 period, and that's all we allow. It's a pretty strict test, isn't it? Plus or minus 1 period. And that's because it's valid to start these counts from either the swing high or the closing high. Both are valid. And look what's happened now to the 70. The 70 is sitting happily on that subsequent high, again a counter trend high, which came on April the 18th, if you want to look at these things on your chart. So the 44 has now claimed a high that we had already previously identified with a different part of this sequence. Okay, that's the big news in this. Let's move on and see. We've moved now up to moved our starting count up to a low before the low. That's clearly a swing low. The 44 has now given us 1 bar past the low, which came on May the 3rd. And have a look at the 70 now. The 62's 1 bar past the next low, and the 70 is giving us the momentum high of this next move up into early 12th of June. And you can see that just in these few charts how one cycle is subsumed by another cycle. In other words, an important high or low that's caught with one group of these Daniel Code cycles is then caught again by a different cycle. In other words, there must be a known relationship equal to the Daniel Code ratios between the swing highs and swing lows that we're using to start our count. Have a look at this. This is the pullback, the September-October start of the fourth quarter rundown, and we've started here from a pretty prominent swing low, which was let me just move my chart and get up to date with it, and that is the closing low of the low on June the 27th. That was a Wednesday. The chart low is the next day, but June the 27th is the closing low of that swing. And look what we've got. We've got the high before the high, 1 bar early. 44's identified that within 1 bar. We allow that. The 62 is now sitting right on the high. This is the all-time high, September 21st. And the 70 is sitting on the counter-trend high, the very next high that popped up on October the 3rd. Now, make a note of which highs and lows have been identified, because you're going to see, as this move this count along, those same highs and lows. You see the main high here is on a 62. Let's move on. Now we've got exactly that same high. That's the high, which is September the 21st, 18. It's now being hit by the 44 cycle, and we've started that from a swing low. Pretty obvious little minor swing low there. It's got the 44 cycle. As well as that, the 62 has now given us the counter trend high, the first rally out of the push down, which came on October the 17th, and the very next low is on the 70, and that was October the 29th. Why am I going through this at such laborious detail? I'm trying to show you that all markets move according to these Daniel Code time ratios. And for those of you who are taking the time to learn trading time as a trading technique, I know that all of you who've done it have been completely amazed. There's many of you who've yet to do it, and I hope you'll take that opportunity. Let's move on. We're doing exactly the same thing. Nothing too magical about any of this. We're now using we've moved up. We're now using the swing low on September the 7th. No real argument. That's a swing low. It's also a low before the low. Now the 44 is giving us the high, the counter trend high, which we'd already previously identified, which came in November the 8th. And the 62 is one bar past the next counter trend high, which the due date was December the 3rd. The due date on the blue line is the next day, December the 4th. We got the high 1 day early. That's allowable. We say that we allow a 1 day plus or minus 1 day period. Now look what's happened. We just identified that high. Let me go back, just refresh your memories. 1 day off the 62 was 1 day off the high, the little gap up high, which was on December the 3rd. Now let's move on to that next chart. Now we've got exactly the same high. It's now identified to the day by the 44 cycle, and we've started that, as you can see, from that minor low between. It's a low before the low. It's a swing low. It has a higher bar on either side, and more than that, the bottom of this whole move down is now being caught by the 59 cycle, and that came on December the 24th. Now that's the actual closing low, the momentum low. That has the lowest close of any bar. The chart low, the lowest low, comes on the next bar. But the momentum low, the one you needed to get your buy signal from, was December the 24th. And of course, we had time there, multiplicities of time, and that gave us the buy signal to be executed the next day, and off we went. Since then, we've had two minor cycles, as you can see, the 62 and the 70, and both of them have led to a minor correction. They are support and resistance. In this case, they are resistance in time. Okay, this I think is the final chart, and this is what we've been doing with the sixth seal on the S&P E-mini, and this is just showing you the trading since that little gap up high, which was December the 3rd in the S&P. You'll see that the first bar, the very first bar after that, was a signal that the trend had turned down. In the same way, at the low, which was came the day the chart low came the day after the momentum low, which is the 59 cycle, that single bar turned the trend up. Now, those are both very big bars. It's quite obvious that there's a probable trend change there. But the reality is, better than 92% of the time, you should be able to determine probable trend from a single bar. And that's key to trading time. We need to know the trend because we bias our risk management to be more generous if we think we're taking a trade with the trend, and more aggressive if we are thinking a trade which at the time we place it is probably against the trend. And you can see from this particular example, every single turn has got either a time buy or a time sell on it. And in the case of the outside bars, both. This is unusual. This doesn't always happen like this. This is an unusual piece of chart because there's so much emotion in the market that the time signals they're ruling things. It's just they do all the time, but sometimes it's a lot easier for you to see, and quite extraordinary. I hope you've got that message about how time works in a multiplicity of layers. We see this again and again and again, that we identify future highs and lows on the basic Daniel Code time cycles, and then they're picked up by another time cycle, the same bar, or maybe one bar's variance, that's all. That's telling us that that same relationship as there is between the basic Daniel Code time cycles is what's happening in the market, because it all originates. We're not changing the length of the cycles. We're simply changing where they start from. So I hope that that's blown your socks off. If you want to be a super trader and learn how to trade time in particular, please email me, jneedham@thedanielcode.com. I'll be more than happy to call you. Let me know your phone number, where you live, and so I can work out the time zones. I don't want to call you in the middle of the night, and talk to you about your trading and the opportunities for you to do a Daniel Code video tutorial. If you haven't already had a free trial of everything of the Daniel Code, we're most happy to extend that offer to you. Go to the website www.thedanielcode.com and get your username. Terry will switch you on for a 31-day free trial of everything. And if you haven't also learnt about Genesis Trade Navigator, who are my partners in this business, well, at least as far as their program software is concerned, and which I'm happy to recommend, we can arrange for you to have a free trial of their software as well. Finally, let me show you our compliance page. I like to make the point, be very, very careful with trading futures, folks. If you don't know how to trade, the overwhelming probability is you'll lose your money, and you'll lose it quickly. Take the time, I implore you, to learn how to trade properly before you risk real money trading. And no, it's not something that you can learn on the internet, but I'm happy to teach you and make you an elite trader. Okay, I think that's all for us today. We just had a question from Akshay, who's a very long time Daniel Code member, about what I see the market doing going forward. And he's talking about equities. Well, it's really not my job to tell you what I think the market might do, because I don't know. But what I do know is that from every completed bar on a chart, I know exactly what are the orders that should be placed to capture the probabilities that will occur tomorrow. But interestingly enough, this is a very long-term chart of the S&P. This is, in fact, the index, dollar SPX. This is the index. This market topped out. Look at this thicker blue line in the middle. This is the median of this Daniel Code trading channel. And this market topped out 1, 2, 3 levels, or three, they're not standard deviations, they're Daniel Code deviations from the mean. They work the same way as a standard deviation, but we use Daniel Code ratios instead of 1. So this market topped out at 3 Daniel Code standard deviation from the mean. Look what we've had in the correction here. It's only corrected down to 2 Daniel Code standard deviations from the mean. So if I was asked, I would expect to have considerably more sideways movement, and I would expect that at some stage this year we'll get a test of 3 Daniel Code deviations from the mean, which at present that number is down about 22.68. And I think the probability, given the robust economic situation in the States, I think the probabilities are that we're going to get a sustained sideways move below the old highs. But it doesn't really matter what I think. What matters is that we can create the trading signals, because as we trade futures, we get paid exactly the same way at the same amount if the market's going down as if it's going up. But the old saying is markets go up by the stairs, and down by the escalator. So every trader loves loves a bear market now and again, and no one loves it more than me. So good fun. Thank you for your attention today. For those of you who attended the original version of this webinar, I do apologize for the problems with audio. This is a new recording of the same material, and I hope you can pick up any bits that you left. Thank you. I look forward to seeing you again shortly. Bye for now.